bit, will they be spread fairly evenly between countries, or will it cost some countries more than others?
Well, we argue, I may, with Siobhan's permission, turn to her, and she's been much more associated with these kinds of international negotiation mechanisms. We do argue in the report that rich countries should take the lion's share of the cost, and that is part of Kyoto in terms of the common but differentiated responsibility. But Siobhan, do you want to say something? We're off to Nairobi next week.
In the report, we look at the various ways you can think about splitting the cost, and various people have suggested different principles for doing it, kind of per capita emissions, or contraction and convergence is sometimes called, and also the proposals that have been put forward for multi-stage and multi-track approaches, a multi-stage approach where people gradually take on more commitments as they reach particular thresholds of income or emissions or both, and a multi-track approach where some countries are expected to take a different approach forever. What we found when we looked at the analysis was that if you compare what you expect under those different systems, actually it's really rather similar. You expect rich countries to take responsibility for between 60 and 80% of their own emissions, for cutting 60 to 80% of their own emissions. That doesn't necessarily have to happen within their own borders. If it's done through trading, then it can be done in a way that generates investment flows to developing countries. It makes more difference for developing countries how costs are shared out, and if you look at per capita or income-based criteria, then India and Africa get very much bigger allocations if you look at allocating rights on the basis of per capita or adjusting it for income. If you do it according to need or sort of expected growth, then China and India get a much bigger share of emissions. But even within that, there is, in general principle, there is scope for some growth in all developing countries. They will need new technologies to be able to meet the growth that they expect to have over the next 50 years, and to stay within any kind of pathway that takes us towards a global stabilisation between 450 and 550. And those technologies are ones which we can see, we know they exist, and we know they can be put in place. It's carbon capture and storage, renewables, all of those things in power. In transport, they're a little bit further off, but there are options out there. And trading would bring forward the kind of investment flows that are needed to make that happen. But you do need to scale up the mechanisms that we've got to do that. The clean development mechanism at the moment is project-based. It's very small relative to the scale of the problem, has lots of transaction costs, and it's not a big enough pull. It's not a big enough incentive for countries to consider changing their whole power generation structure or their entire transport networks. And we need to move to something which is now much more systematic and which responds to rewarding good policies and good programs of work in countries rather than just project by project examples of how you might do things in a new way. And that's something that I think the negotiations really need to focus on. It's something that there are ideas out there. The negotiators are beginning to explore this, but the sort of default position is to think about how to tweak the clean development mechanism, how to make small adjustments, but actually I think it's very important now to think very creatively about scaling up to a very different scale for the flows that will happen.
Could you perhaps say something, Guy also mentioned about timescales, could you perhaps pick that up?
We now have quite a small window of opportunity to do something. We have maybe 10 to 15 years to change the investment decisions that are being made, to change infrastructure, and the negotiating process is much slower than that. The negotiations at the moment are focusing on a 2-year dialogue under the convention. This is the middle year, but it's 4 workshops in total, and it's still not a negotiating mandate. If a negotiating mandate were to emerge next year, then it would still be a year, 2 years, 3 years before negotiators would get to the point of making a deal. There would then be a process of ratification. It could be very slow. So I think it's very important now to look at how we can get quite large-scale pilot programs underway, how we can use the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the regional development banks. They have begun this process after the Gleneagles Summit last year. They started to develop an energy investment framework which helps put together the carbon finance mechanisms we've got, like the clean development mechanism, with the risk guarantees and the loans and the concessional finance and so on that they have available, and to bring in the private sector as well so that they can create